The mission was supposed to be simple, a show of force, a quick, intimidating pass over the insurgent-held valley to scatter them, allowing a trapped Special Forces team to extract. Captain Ava Rostova completed her pre-flight check with a methodical calm that belied the tension coiling in her gut. Her WSO, Lieutenant Jess Cooper, was already strapped in, humming a quiet tune. A faded photograph of her two young boys was tucked securely next to her navigation display. The morning sun glinted off the A-10 Thunderbolt II's rugged, almost ugly airframe. This was the Warthog, built around a massive, terrifying gun designed for one thing: close air support. It was a flying tank, and Ava was its pilot. She loved this machine, its raw power, its stubborn resilience. Today, that resilience would be tested beyond any simulation. Tower. Hog 7-1 requesting clearance for takeoff. Eva's voice was steady, a professional monotone through the headset. Clearance granted, Hog 7-1. Winds are light. You are cleared for runway 29er. Good hunting. The twin turbofans roared to life, pushing Eva back into her seat as the jet thundered down the runway and lifted smoothly into the pale blue sky. The Afghan mountains sprawled beneath them, a beautiful, brutal landscape of sharp peaks and deep shadows where death could hide. 30 minutes to the coordinates, Jess reported, her voice all business now. The ground team calls themselves Rifle Scope. They're pinned down on a hillside. Enemy forces are using a network of caves. Copy that, Eva replied, her eyes scanning the horizon. Let's make this a quick one. I promised you I'd get you back for your son's birthday party on Saturday. Jess chuckled. And I intend to hold you to that, Captain. No detours. The flight was uneventful, the jet cruising efficiently towards the conflict zone. Then the radio crackled to life. It was a voice tight with strain, the sound of distant gunfire punctuating every word. Any station, this is Rifle Scope Actual. We are taking heavy fire. Requesting immediate air support. They have us zeroed in. Ava exchanged a glance with Jess, though they couldn't see each other's faces. The mission had just changed. Hang tight, Rifle Scope. This is Hog 7-1. We are inbound. 2 minutes out. Stand by for a show. Ava pushed the throttle forward, the jet surging ahead. They broke through a thin layer of cloud, and the valley lay before them. She could see the tiny, desperate figures of the Allied team, their position marked by small puffs of smoke from their own weapons. Larger, darker plumes erupted around them as enemy mortar rounds walked closer. Jess, you see them? Visual confirmed. Marking targets now. The familiar, comforting routine of the combat dive began. Ava lined up the aircraft, the targeting pipper settling over the enemy positions Jess had identified. The world narrowed to the crosshairs and the steady tone in her headset. Rifle Scope, Hog 7-1 is in hot. The most distinctive sound in modern warfare followed. The brrrr-t of the Gayu-8 Avenger cannon. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a sustained, earth-shattering roar that vibrated through the entire airframe. 500 rounds tore into the mountainside, obliterating the enemy nest in a storm of dust and fire. Good effect on target. The ground commander's voice came through, filled with palpable relief. They're scattering! Preparing to move! Eva pulled back on the stick, the G-forces pressing down on her as the Warthog climbed away from the valley floor. A smile touched her lips. A job well done. They had turned the tide. It was in that moment of triumph that the threat warning screamed in her ears. A shrill, piercing sound that froze the blood. Sam! Sam! Launch warning! 3 o'clock. Jess's voice was sharp, urgent. Eva's training took over. She slammed the stick, throwing the jet into a hard, evasive break, releasing chaff and flares in a desperate cloud. Her eyes scanned for the missile's telltale smoke trail. There it was. A streaking line of death impossibly fast, coming from a hidden position they had missed. Second launch! Second launch! Jess yelled. Eva jinked the jet again, her body straining against the harness. The first missile shot past, fooled by the countermeasures. The second was not. The impact was not an explosion, but a colossal, jarring slam. The world dissolved into a cacophony of shrieking metal and screaming wind. The canopy vanished, shredded into a million glittering pieces. The roar of the engines was drowned out by the hurricane-force wind tearing through the cockpit. Warning lights flashed across her panel, a frantic red and yellow Christmas tree of failure. Hydraulic failure. Primary and secondary. "We've lost flight controls," Ava shouted, fighting the stick which felt like concrete. "Jess! Status! Silence! Jess, report!" Ava risked a glance to her right. Jess was slumped in her seat, her helmet cracked, a dark stream of blood running down her flight suit. Unconscious, or worse. The jet began to shudder, a death rattle. They were losing altitude, spinning slowly, uncontrollably. The mountains, once below, now rose up to meet them. They were going down. The major would soon be on the line, telling command that Hog 701 had been shot apart. And for all intents and purposes, he was right. The wind was a physical beast, a 1,000-pound gale trying to tear her from the cockpit. Ava's lungs burned, fighting to draw breath in the thin, screaming air. The stick fought her, a dead weight in her hands. The altimeter spun down, a relentless countdown to impact. 5,000 feet. The jagged teeth of the Hindu Kush reached for her. This was how it ended. A brief, brilliant flash, then nothing. She saw Jess's photo of the two boys, still miraculously tucked by the console. Their faces, smiling and innocent, snapped something inside her. No, not today. Her training, drilled into her over thousands of hours, surfaced through the panic. The A-10 had a manual reversion system, a last-ditch mechanical link to the control surfaces. It required brute strength. She released the stiff, unresponsive stick and grabbed the manual reversion T-handle, pulling it with all her might. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a solid mechanical clunk, she felt a new, raw connection to the wings. The stick moved, heavy as stone, but it moved. She hauled it back into her gut. The jet's nose, sluggishly, agonizingly, began to lift. The spin slowed. The mountains, which had filled her entire field of vision, began to recede, replaced by the bruised purple of the high-altitude sky. She was flying. Barely. It was like steering a truck with flat tires through mud. Every minor adjustment was a monumental effort. She scanned the ravaged instrument panel. Hydraulics were gone. Electrical systems were failing, but the two massive turbofan engines, mounted high on the tail, were still running. They were her only prayer. "Jess, can you hear me?" she yelled over the wind roar. There was no response, no movement. She had to get them lower, to thicker air, and she had to find a place to land this wreck. The initial course home was impossible. It was over 100 miles of hostile territory. She would never make it. Her eyes fell on the emergency data panel. A heading and distance glowed faintly. Fob Jackson. A small, remote forward operating base. 30 miles. It was their only chance. She banked the jet, a slow, wide turn that felt like trying to steer a barge. The wind ripped at her, tearing at her gloves and oxygen mask. The cold was a penetrating ache, seeping through her flight suit, numbing her fingers. She focused on the simple, brutal act of keeping the wings level. She was no longer a pilot. She was a machine, an extension of the crippled aircraft, her will the only thing keeping it in the air. Minutes felt like hours. The landscape below was a blur of brown and gray. She kept her eyes locked on the heading indicator, a single unwavering point in a world of chaos. She tried the radio again. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Any station, this is Hog 7-1. I am declaring an emergency." Static was her only reply. The blast must have taken out the long-range antenna. They were utterly alone, then a flicker on the horizon. A smudge of human activity in the vast wilderness. Fob Jackson. It wasn't a proper airfield. It was a dusty outpost with a short, rough landing strip carved out of the dirt, meant for helicopters and small cargo planes. Not a battered A-10 with no controls and no brakes. But it was a chance. It was land, not rock. She began her descent, the jet groaning in protest. She lowered the landing gear using the emergency pneumatic system. A series of thuds and a new alarming shudder told her the gear was down but likely damaged. She didn't have the hydraulics for flaps or speed brakes. She was coming in too fast, too high. It was going to be a crash landing. She glanced once more at Jess. "Hang on," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. "Just hang on." She lined up with the crude runway. Soldiers on the ground were scattering, pointing at the approaching ghost of a jet. She could see the dust kicking up from her own speed. She pulled the throttle to idle. The ground rushed up to meet her. There was no more time for thought. There was only the impact. The tires hit the dirt strip with a shriek of protesting rubber and a shower of sparks. The force slammed Ava forward against her harness straps. The aircraft, devoid of brakes or steering, careened down the runway, a massive, out-of-control projectile. It veered violently to the left, threatening to ground loop and snap in half. Ava fought the dead stick, her muscles screaming as she applied opposite pressure, a desperate and primitive form of steering. The world outside was a dizzying blur of dust, sky, and the frantic figures of soldiers diving for cover. The left wing dipped, the tip gouging a deep furrow in the rocky soil. The sound was a horrible, grinding tear of metal. The drag was immense, acting as a brutal, unintended brake. The warthog spun in a slow, sickening circle, churning up a storm of dirt and debris before finally, miraculously, lurching to a stop. Silence descended, broken only by the pinging of hot metal and the hiss of escaping pressure. For a moment, Ava just sat there, stunned, her hands locked in a death grip on the controls. Her ears rang in the sudden quiet. Then the training kicked back in. Shutdown procedure. Her movements were clumsy, her fingers numb with cold and adrenaline. She reached with a trembling hand and cut the engines. The whine of the turbines died away, leaving an eerie calm. She turned. Jess was still motionless. Medic! The scream tore from her raw throat, barely a whisper. She fumbled with her harness releases, her body aching from the punishment. Boots pounded on the tarmac. A team of Army medics swarmed the aircraft, climbing onto the wings with practiced urgency. They carefully extracted Jess, placing her onto a waiting stretcher. Ava watched, her heart in her throat, as they rushed her away towards a waiting medevac helicopter. She unclipped her oxygen mask and pulled off her helmet, the cold air feeling strange on her face. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. Strong hands caught her, easing her down onto the wing route. A soldier offered her a canteen. She drank, the warm water tasting like the finest thing she had ever known. She looked back at her aircraft. It was a wreck. The canopy was gone, the left wingtip was shredded, and the fuselage was peppered with holes. It was a testament to violence and a monument to survival. The base commander, a haggard-looking colonel with dust on his boots, approached her. Captain Rostova? I'm Colonel Miller. That was the most incredible piece of flying I have ever seen. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight. Your WSO is in capable hands. We've already alerted your home base. They thought you were gone. Just then, the distinct thrumming of approaching helicopters grew louder. 2 Blackhawks descended onto the FOB's landing pad. The first was the medevac, its doors closing around Jess's stretcher. The second carried a different kind of urgency. The side door slid open, and Major Davis jumped out before the skids had even fully touched the ground. His face was pale, his eyes wide as he scanned the scene, taking in the destroyed A-10, and then, finally, landing on Ava. He strode towards her, his expression unreadable. He stopped a few feet away, and for a long moment he just looked at her, standing there in her torn flight suit, covered in grime and hydraulic fluid. The officer who had declared her dead was now faced with the living, breathing proof of his error. He didn't say a word. He simply snapped a sharp, perfect salute, his hand trembling slightly. It was a gesture that held a universe of meaning, apology, respect, and sheer, unvarnished awe. Ava, her body trembling with exhaustion and shock, slowly, stiffly, returned the salute. The formalities complete, Major Davis closed the distance between them. The stern commander facade crumbled. Ava, he said, his voice thick with emotion. My God, Eva, we thought we lost you. He put a hand on her shoulder, a simple human touch that conveyed more than any debriefing ever could. She had not just saved her aircraft and her WSO. She had defied the very calculus of war. The flight back to her home base was a surreal, silent journey in the cargo hold of a C-130. Wrapped in a thermal blanket, Eva stared at the vibrating fuselage, not seeing the metal but the endless, screaming sky. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a deep, bone-weary emptiness in its place. Every muscle ached, a symphony of pain conducted by the violent landing. The image of Jess, limp and bleeding, played on a loop behind her eyes. She had brought the plane home, but had she brought her friend home? When the Hercules landed and the ramp lowered, The scene that greeted her was nothing like the somber departure of the morning. The entire wing seemed to be on the flight line. A crowd of pilots, crew chiefs, and support staff had gathered. As Ava, supported by Major Davis, walked shakily down the ramp, a silence fell over them. Then, one by one, they began to applaud. It wasn't a raucous cheer, but a slow, respectful, heartfelt ovation. They were saluting not just her survival, but the sheer impossible skill it had required. A grizzled master sergeant, a man who had seen everything, met her eyes and gave a single solemn nod. That meant more than any medal. The next 48 hours were a blur of debriefings, medical checks, and forced rest. The doctors diagnosed her with severe bruising, minor ligament strains, and the early signs of frostbite on her cheeks and hands. The psychological team asked her about the incident, about Jess. She answered in short, professional sentences, locking the storm of emotion deep inside. She was a pilot. She had done her job. Her first real moment of clarity came when she was finally cleared to visit Jess in the base hospital. She stood outside the room for a long time, her hand hovering over the door handle, afraid of what she would find. She pushed the door open. Jess was propped up in bed, her head bandaged, one arm in a sling. She was pale, but her eyes were open and they were clear. And she was smiling. "Took you long enough," Jess said, her voice raspy but strong. "I heard you tried to park my jet without a canopy. They're going to charge you for the extra ventilation." A sound escaped Ava's throat, something between a sob and a laugh. The iron control she had maintained for days shattered. Tears she didn't know she had been holding back streamed down her face. She stumbled to the bedside and gently took Jess's good hand. "They told me what you did," Jess whispered, her own eyes glistening. "They told me everything. You saved my life, Ava. You got me home to my boys." Ava could only shake her head, unable to form words. The weight of it all, the fear, the responsibility, the relief, came crashing down on her in that sterile hospital room. She hadn't cried when the missile hit. She hadn't cried during the desperate flight or the crash landing. But here, in the face of her friend's gratitude, she finally broke. Later that day, she was summoned to the hangar. The wreck of her A-10, call sign Hog 7-1, had been transported back. It sat under the bright hangar lights, a silent, scarred beast. Ground crews were already assessing the damage, their low whistles a testament to the extent of the punishment it had absorbed. The entire left wing needed replacement. The fuselage was a patchwork of holes and torn metal. The cockpit was a hollowed-out shell. She walked slowly around it, her boots echoing on the concrete. She reached out and touched the cold, ripped skin near the torn-off canopy. This machine, this collection of wires and metal had saved them. It had taken a direct hit from a surface-to-air missile and kept flying. It had obeyed her last desperate commands and brought them home. It was more than an aircraft. It was a partner. A feeling of profound gratitude, mixed with a fierce, protective grief, washed over her. They would likely scrap it, cannibalize it for parts. It was a logical, practical end. But to her, it felt like saying goodbye to a member of the crew who had given everything. She stood there for a long time, saying a silent thank you to the Warthog, the jet that refused to die. The summons to the wing commander's office came a week later. Eva stood at attention, her service dress uniform crisp, the memory of the flight suit's grime a distant ghost on her skin. Brigadier General Hayes did not sit behind his desk. He stood before a large window, the airfield sprawling behind him. "At ease, Captain," he said, his voice a low rumble. He turned, holding a small velvet box. "What you did out there was more than a display of superior airmanship. It was a testament to a will I have rarely seen. You exhibited courage, resourcefulness, and a devotion to your wingman that embodies the very best of this command." He opened the box. Inside, nestled on blue velvet, was the Distinguished Flying Cross. "It is my distinct honor to present you with this." He pinned the medal to her chest. The weight of it was surprising, both physical and symbolic. Cameras flashed, documenting the moment. The official handshake was firm, but as the photographers filed out, General Hayes's demeanor shifted. The formal commander receded, revealing the veteran pilot beneath. He gestured for her to follow him. They walked not to his desk, but to a side door that led directly onto a balcony overlooking the main hangar. Below them, bathed in the bright work lights, sat her A-10. But it was no longer a shattered wreck. Crews had washed it, and the worst of the battle damage had been patched or marked for repair. A large banner was hung above it, reading, "The Phoenix." "Your bird, Captain," Hayes said, leaning on the railing. "The maintenance chief tells me it's a miracle it held together. They're going to fully restore it. It's become a symbol for the whole wing." Eva looked down at the scarred jet, her throat tight. They weren't going to scrap it. They were going to bring it back to life. The official recognition was one thing, a necessary piece of military protocol. But this respect for the machine that had saved them, felt more personal, more profound. The ceremony for the whole wing was held that afternoon on the flight line. Ranks of airmen and officers stood in formation. Jess was there in a wheelchair, her son's photograph tucked into the band of her service cap. General Hayes gave a speech, his voice carrying over the loudspeakers detailing the events of that day. He spoke of the SAM, the loss of controls, the impossible flight home. He spoke of duty. But then he paused, looking directly at Eva. "But there is more to our service than duty. There is the bond between a pilot and her aircraft. And there is the sacred promise we make to the person in the cockpit next to us." Captain Rostova honored that promise. She brought her wingman home. He called Jess forward. With Eva's help, Jess stood from her wheelchair. The general then presented her with the Purple Heart. And then, to a roaring applause from the formation, her own Air Medal. The two women stood side by side before their comrades, one with a distinguished flying cross, the other with a Purple Heart, linked forever by the shared crucible of the sky. Later, as the formation was dismissed and people began to mingle, a family approached Eva. A man, his face etched with a relief so deep it looked like pain, and two young boys, the very same boys from the photograph in the cockpit. The older one looked up at Eva, his eyes wide with a hero worship that made her feel both proud and humble. "Captain Rostova," the man said, his voice cracking, "I'm Ben Cooper, Jess's husband. We." He couldn't finish. He simply pulled Eva into a fierce, grateful hug. When he let go, the younger boy, no more than 5, tugged on her pant leg. "Thank you for bringing our mommy back," he said. Eva knelt down, her metal clinking softly, and looked the boy in the eye. In that moment, every bit of fear, every ounce of pain, every second of the struggle was worth it. This was why they flew. This was why they fought. Not for glory, but for this, for the chance for a little boy to have his mother home. "It was my honor," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Your mom is the bravest person I know." She stood and shook Ben Cooper's hand again, a silent understanding passing between them. The official recognition was a memory etched in a citation. But this, the grateful handshake of a husband, the trusting eyes of a child, this was a reward that would last a lifetime. The world moved on. The headlines faded. The Phoenix was slowly, meticulously rebuilt in its hangar, a skeleton crew of the Air Force's best technicians working to restore the Warthog's strength. For Eva, the return to a normal flight schedule was a distant prospect. The doctors and psychologists were clear she needed time. Grounded, she felt untethered, the solid earth feeling wrong beneath her feet. She spent her days in the simulators, running through emergency procedures until her responses were flawless again, a form of therapy that felt more real than talking. It was during one of these long, quiet afternoons that a familiar, stern-faced man was shown into her small office. Her father, Colonel Rostov, retired, stood in the doorway. He wore a simple suit, but he still carried himself with the rigid posture of a commanding officer. Their relationship had always been a battlefield of its own. His disapproval of her career choice a constant low-grade tension. "Eva," he said, his voice neutral. "Father," she replied, standing. This is a surprise. He didn't sit. His eyes scanned. Her office lingering for a moment on a framed photo of her graduating flight school. He had not attended the ceremony. I read the report, he said finally. The declassified summary. Ava said nothing. She simply waited, the old defenses rising within her, ready for the critique, the reminder that she had chosen a dangerous, unseemly path. He turned to face her fully, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. It wasn't pride exactly. It was a raw, unvarnished respect. "The manual reversion," he said. "At that altitude, with that damage. The report said it was nearly impossible." "It was that or die," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. He took a step closer. "When you were a girl, you asked me why I didn't want you to fly. I told you it was because it was too dangerous. That was a lie." He paused, gathering, his words like a soldier preparing for a difficult mission. "The truth was, I was afraid you would be better than me. My father, your grandfather, was a pilot, a great one. I washed out of flight school. I could never master the stick. I chose the infantry because it was ground I could understand." The confession hung in the air, stunning Eva into silence. A lifetime of perceived disappointment, of never measuring up, dissolved in that single honest admission. His sternness hadn't been disapproval. It had been a father's fear, projected as control. "I was wrong," he said, the words clearly costing him a great effort. "What you did, the skill, the courage, it wasn't just flying. It was command. It was sacrifice. You are a better officer than I ever was." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn black and white photograph. It was her grandfather, standing by the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang. "He would have been proud of you, Ava. And so am I." He placed the photograph on her desk. It was the same one she had stared at as a child, the one that had first ignited her dream. She looked from the photo to her father's face, and for the first time she saw not a colonel, but just her father. The walls she had built over decades crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or relief. They were tears of a long-awaited peace. "Thank you, Father," she whispered. He gave a single sharp nod, the closest he would ever come to a hug. He turned and left, leaving her alone with the photograph, and the profound silence of a war finally ended. The medal from the general had been a validation of her profession. These words from her father were a validation of her soul. She had spent her life trying to earn a salute from a man who had been too afraid to give it. Now, she realized, the only salute that had ever truly mattered was the one she had given herself every time she climbed into the cockpit, refusing to quit. The sky was no longer a place to prove herself. It was simply home, and she was finally, completely, ready to return. The first flight back is never just a flight. It is a trial, a reckoning, a conversation between a pilot and the sky. The medical board had cleared her. The psychologists had signed the forms. But the final approval came from within, and Ava had wrestled with that demon for weeks. The memory of the wind's scream and the dead stick were ghosts in her mind. Today was the day to silence them. She walked towards the active runway, her flight suit feeling both familiar and foreign. This was not the Phoenix. Her original jet was still months from being airworthy. This was another A-10, callsign Hog 42, a trusted spare. But as she approached, she saw a small figure leaning against the landing gear. Jess Cooper, her arm out of the sling but still moving stiffly, gave her a lopsided grin. "Thought you might try to sneak off without a proper send-off," Jess said. "You're supposed to be on light duty," Eva replied, a real smile touching her lips for the first time in weeks. "And watching my pilot go back into the wild is light duty. It's crucial morale support." Jess stepped forward, her smile softening. "Seriously, Eva, you ready for this?" Ava looked past her at the clean, unbroken lines of the Warthog's canopy. She saw her own reflection, superimposed over the cockpit. "I have to be," she said quietly, Jess nodded. Just remember, the jet wants to fly. It's what it's built for. And so are you. She handed Eva a small laminated photo. It was a new picture of Jess's two boys, both giving a thumbs up. A little extra motivation. Bring her back in one piece. Again. The gesture was simple, but it anchored Eva. This was why. Always for the person next to you. She took the photo and tucked it securely into a clear pocket on her kneeboard. Always, she promised. The pre-flight check was a meditation, a ritual of switches and gauges that calmed her racing heart. Strapping in, the harness felt like a homecoming. She closed the canopy, and the world became quiet, familiar. The roar of the engine starting was a comforting vibration, not a threat. She taxied to the runway, her breathing steady. Tower, Hog 4-2, ready for takeoff. Clear for takeoff, Hog 4-2, winds are calm. Welcome back, Captain. The words were a balm. She pushed the throttles forward. The acceleration pressed her back, the jet gathering speed, eager, alive. The moment the wheels left the tarmac, a profound sense of rightness settled over her. The fear was still there, a quiet hum in the background, but it was overshadowed by a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. She was where she belonged. She climbed to her assigned altitude, the Afghan mountains sprawling beneath her in all their terrible beauty. There was no tension in her hands on the controls, only a confident, gentle pressure. The sky was not her enemy. It was her element. She banked into a wide turn, the wings slicing through the thin, cold air. She performed a series of basic maneuvers, feeling the jet respond perfectly, a seamless extension of her will. Then, on the horizon, she saw it. A long, distinctive contrail. A KC-135 Stratotanker, a flying gas station. It wasn't on her flight plan. A private request from Major Davis, she realized. A final test of nerve. The last time she had approached a tanker, her cockpit was gone and her WSO was bleeding out. Her throat went dry. She could abort. No one would blame her. But she saw the small laminated photo on her kneeboard, the two smiling boys. She thought of Jess's trust. She thought of her father's respect. She keyed the mic. Pegasus 22, this is Hog 4-2, requesting practice connection. Roger. Hog 4-2, cleared to pre-contact position. She nudged the throttle, sliding the Warthog into formation just below and behind the massive tanker. The turbulence from its wake buffeted her jet. Her knuckles were white on the stick. She took a deep, slow breath. She remembered Jess's words. The jet wants to fly. She focused on the basket trailing from the tanker's boom, a small weaving circle in the air. It was a dance, a delicate, precise dance. She inched closer, her entire world narrowing to that basket. With a final, minute adjustment, she pushed the probe forward. A solid clunk. Connected. Fuel began to flow. She held the formation, rock steady, for a full minute. There was no wind, no panic. Only the calm, professional execution of a difficult task. She had not just refueled her aircraft. She had reclaimed her sky. She disconnected smoothly and dropped away from the tanker. Good work, Hog 4-2, any time. Eva turned for home, the sun glinting off her canopy. The ghosts were silent. The past was just that, the past. She was a pilot again. And she was unafraid. The final chapter was not written in a report or celebrated in a ceremony. It was written in the quiet, steady rhythm of a life reclaimed. Months had passed. The seasons had turned. Eva Rostova flew regular sorties now, her name just another on the flight roster. Her legend settled into the fabric of the wing, a story told to new pilots not as a myth, but as a standard to uphold. She stood once more in the vast, echoing hangar. But this time, the space was not silent. It was filled with the hum of activity and the smell of fresh paint. The Phoenix was no longer a scarred wreck. It was whole. New wings gleamed under the fluorescent lights. A pristine canopy was sealed tight over a fully restored cockpit. The maintenance crews were putting the final touches on the aircraft, buffing its gray skin to a brilliant shine. The battle damage was gone, but the memory was preserved in the new serial number and the small, tasteful plaque bolted to the fuselage just below the cockpit. The Phoenix. She rose again. Eva ran her hand over the cool, smooth metal where a gaping hole had once been. It felt like visiting an old friend who had survived a terrible illness and was now stronger than ever. The chief master sergeant in charge of the restoration approached, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "She's ready for you, Captain," he said, a note of profound satisfaction in his voice. "All systems are green. She's waiting." The following morning, Eva performed the walk around with a ceremonial slowness. Jess Cooper, now fully medically cleared and back on flight status, stood by as her WSO once more. There were no speeches today, no crowds. This was a private homecoming. They climbed into the cockpit, the familiar routine feeling like a prayer of gratitude. Eva strapped in, her eyes falling on the new photo tucked next to Jess's station, a recent picture of Jess's family, all of them smiling, whole. "Ready to see if she still remembers us?" Jess asked through the intercom. "Let's find out," Eva replied, her voice calm and sure. Engine start was smooth. Taxiing to the runway, the jet felt responsive, eager. They lined up on the center line. The tower's clearance came through. "Hog 7-1, you are cleared for takeoff. The sky is yours." Eva pushed the throttles forward. The acceleration was a familiar, powerful shove. As the wheels left the ground, there was no tension, no ghost of past trauma. There was only the pure, unburdened joy of flight. The Phoenix climbed gracefully, its movements crisp and clean. It was no longer a wounded bird, but a predator restored to its full power. They flew a simple, celebratory loop around the mountain ranges that had once nearly claimed them. The sun was bright, the sky a deep, endless blue. It was a perfect day to fly. Banking over the airbase, Eva could see the tiny figures of ground crew looking up, a few hands raised in waves. She rocked the wings once, a final gentle salute. The landing was flawless, a whisper of tires on tarmac, a testament to both the perfect repair of the jet and the complete healing of its pilot. As they taxied back to the hangar, Eva felt a deep, quiet peace. The journey was over. The mission was complete. The aircraft was saved. The wingman was home. The father's pride was won. The sky was once again a friend. She shut down the engines, and in the sudden silence, she placed a hand on the console. "Welcome back," she whispered. Jess unstrapped and looked at her, a knowing smile on her face. "Told you she wanted to fly," Eva nodded. And so did she. The major had said she'd been shot apart, but as she sat in the quiet cockpit of the reborn Phoenix, surrounded by the evidence of resilience and the bonds of family, both by blood and by choice, she knew a different truth. They had not been shot apart. They had been forged together, stronger than before, and they were finally, truly home.